Hello, my name's Jeremy Groombridge, and I have with me this morning Rev Helen Burnett. Helen is in shared ministry at St Luke's in Whiteleaf and St Peter and St Paul's in Chaldon. So welcome, Helen. And I'd like to ask you what prompted you to join the Extinction Rebellion protests in central London?
Well, I joined Extinction Rebellion as a result of having been concerned about climate change for many years and having gone on marches and written letters and been aware of the increasing urgency of the need to act. I'd been involved with other local environmental groups, and at the beginnings of Extinction Rebellion, I joined in with a group called Rising Up, who were the foundation sort of group for Extinction Rebellion. And so I was very taken with the fact that Extinction Rebellion referred to the climate and ecological emergency as being both a physical and a spiritual emergency. So very aware that we are affected spiritually as well as physically by what is happening to God's creation. They wouldn't necessarily put it like that, but it's a very holistic approach to the problem. And so I was involved from the word go, so from the launch of their declaration of an emergency in Parliament Square in 2018 onwards. So in terms of actually joining the protests, the first full protest was a 5 bridges blocking, and then that was followed up by a protest during Easter 2019, when most people will have noticed in the news there was a major occupation of central parts of London. And it was my concern that no other means seemed to be working to bring to the attention of our UK government the plight of our brothers and sisters in the global south who were and are already suffering massively from the effects of climate change.
So what exactly happened then, Helen, at the famous event?
So for a lot of us, we weren't exactly sure what would happen. These things are very much grassroots, and there's an element of surprise involved, otherwise they don't work. So along with a group of fellow activists from the Dorking and Reigate area, whom we had formed into an affinity group, so a group to support each other. We travelled to London. All that we knew was to take a tent and a sleeping bag. So I travelled to London with a tent and a sleeping bag. I then joined members of Christian Climate Action, which is the Christian faith group within Extinction Rebellion, to block one of the major roads in in Marble Arch. So really very much waiting for the say-so to step into the road. And at that point, I stepped into the road with a number of fellow Christians, including 3 members of my congregation who had chosen to join me. And we blocked one of the main roads going into Marble Arch. It might interest your listeners to know that when I turned around to find a juggernaut behind me and wondered whether we blocked the juggernaut, I realised the juggernaut was actually part of the protest, and that under it was a Christian and a retired priest who were locked onto each other to prevent the police being able to quickly move the juggernaut. And the juggernaut then became the main stage for the Marble Arch. And people will remember that there was a similar setup in Oxford Street, and on Waterloo Bridge, and for a while at Piccadilly Circus. And then we stayed for nearly 2 weeks.
Quite an exciting period, wasn't it? And what happened? I believe you were arrested?
I wasn't arrested then, no. This was during Holy Week. So
right.
I was very aware that although there would be people putting themselves forward for arrest, that would not be my role then, because I wanted to maintain my ministry for Holy Week.
Yeah.
So I stayed with the community and travelled to and fro between my tent in Edgware Road and my parish in Chaldon, where my parishioners obviously were. So the arrest that you referred to came in a later rebellion.
Right, okay. What did that feel like, Helen, when you were arrested?
So obviously by then I'd seen a lot of people arrested. I'd stood with people and prayed with people as they were put into police vans. And so this wasn't something new to me. I was very used by then to the idea that people would passively resist and then be arrested. Yeah. And I was clear also that it was this particular rebellion was taking place in the context of something we call the Faith Bridge. And the Faith Bridge was an interfaith movement within XR to stand as people as faith and say this is a matter of huge importance globally. And because of the way it fell in ordinary time, at a time when I didn't have major commitments, I knew that if it became apparent that maybe you could say the Holy Spirit moved me to stay, then that is what would happen, and it wouldn't have consequences for my ministry as such. I mean, it does have consequences, but for the immediate terms of just practical things like taking services.
Yeah.
So I don't think I set out in the very early hours of the morning to be arrested quite like that. It was more that the point came where it was quite clear that the police were not going to allow an occupation in the way that they had done in the Easter Rebellion.
Yes.
And that they were quite aggressively removing people. And this was Lambeth Bridge, right opposite Lambeth Palace. We've been there all day. We had prayed together. We'd had NGOs come and join us. There'd been a lot of activity. There'd been a massive Noah's Ark replica, and in the end that wasn't allowed on the bridge. We carried that, so there'd been a procession with hymn singing. And then it came to about tea time, and it was clear that we were there by then on the opposite side from Lambeth Palace, that the police were going to clear everything. And we were there along with groups from XR Jews and groups from the Southwest Extinction Rebellion regional group. And I felt that if this was going to be the faith bridge, then people of faith needed to step forward and be clearly involved in solidarity with that. So the point came at which the police were asking people to move away, and explaining that you'll be arrested if you didn't, and I chose to stay. I chose to remain in the road, and in fact, because I was wearing my dog collar, a couple of other priests who were involved chose to remain too. So we were a visible priestly presence at that point. And to be honest, at that point, because I knew what the procedures would be, I knew what I needed to say in response to any police officer who approached me. And it had been an extraordinary day. I just entered a place of huge calm, and the space around me felt like holy ground in quite a powerful and profound way, that this was a statement of intent, a statement or a commitment that myself and those around me were going to make, that there were things that were more important than the access of vehicles to this stretch of road, and that were more important than what the police were saying, which was that everybody needed to move. Because at this stage we were very clear, the UK government still wasn't and still isn't really taking this matter seriously. So I remained.
And subsequently you appeared before magistrates, and I believe you told them you conveyed quite a serious message to them on that occasion, which I hope we'll be able to look at subsequently. What did you tell them?
I told them that I had indeed sat in the road, but that, and I told them why. And I told them that if I was to love my neighbor, I mean, in a nutshell, if you're going to listen to it later, but if I were to love my neighbor, if the most foremost commandment of my faith is to love my neighbor as myself, then I cannot allow a system to continue, which means that my neighbor, both human and plant life and all species, is being irrevocably damaged. Then to love my neighbor, I have to sacrifice something. And in this case, it was my clean record, so to speak, which was as nothing compared to people drowning in Bangladesh and species extinction.
Yeah, and that touches on the next point, really, doesn't it? I mean, what in your view is the sort of theological justification for taking steps of civil disobedience in the way that you felt that you had to?
There's a strong tradition of this, isn't there, in recent history, even with Martin Luther King. There's a strong tradition, not faith-based, but with the suffragettes, but there's a strong tradition of using non-violent direct action. We can look at Gandhi and so on, but we can go back also, of course, to our own sacred text. And I find in particular, because we read the Psalms daily, that the Psalms underpin the fact that there's what the nations of the world do, and this is what the nation of God does, God's kingdom. Yeah. And so there's a very clear directive to me, even from the Old Testament, that there are God's laws and there are the ways of the world. And when the ways of the world become directly at odds with God's laws, then I think there is a Christian imperative to act. Ultimately, the ultimate act of non-violent direct action, of passive resistance, was Jesus on the cross.
Yes, I suppose some people might struggle though with the idea that on the one hand, Paul in Romans 13 makes it very clear that we should be subject to the governing authorities, and that those governing authorities have a God-given role. But what you're speaking of is where those governing bodies, those governing authorities take a position that is directly contrary to what you believe is God's law.
That's right. And of course, we know, don't we, that in the context of Paul, he was ultimately arrested and executed. So I think it's an interesting passage to look at. It's a bit like these very particular passages, particularly in Paul's letters, that sort of trip us up sometimes a bit, and we have to discuss them very seriously. And I think to take the rabbinic tradition of actually tackling these difficult texts and saying what was going on here. We have to remember that this was in the context of an oppressive empire, not in the context of a near democracy. And I think that Paul may well have felt he had a duty of care to those who were joining this Christian community, even though we know as it was that once you were baptized, you did go out into the world and you were arrested and you were imprisoned and then you were released and you went back to your community and then the whole thing happened again. It was almost like a revolving door. But I do wonder whether he's saying, take care of yourselves. This is, we're living in dangerous times. So that there may have been some of that about it. We know that ultimately that's not what he did. We know that by living out their faith, people did come directly at odds with the prevailing secular powers. And I think we have to think, how are we living as gospel people? And does that set us at odds? And we've seen it in Bonhoeffer, deciding that actually, no, he wasn't going to obey the Third Reich. Would we say that we should obey whatever the prevailing secular power is? Would we say, for instance, that Bolsonaro, to look at our own context, has a God-given right to rule in the way that he chooses to rule? And without being political, I think we could all think of recent leaders who we would say, is it damaging to take that verse and suggest that because Paul said this line, and in fact a more accurate translation might be submit to the law. I did indeed submit to the law. I went through the processes. So I didn't obey the law at the point at which it felt like my duty not to make a point, but I submitted to the process. And then ultimately Jesus submitted to the process, Paul submitted to the process. So we submit to that because that's the context which we live in. It doesn't mean that we accept it.
Yeah, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit more about Christian Climate Action? I mean, who are they? What do they believe?
So Christian Climate Action actually predates Extinction Rebellion. Christian Climate Action has blossomed with the advent of it's a terrible thing to say really, but with the concerns of Christians around climate change. But prior to the climate change focus, Christian Climate Action existed to point out the very things we've been talking about, the ways in which our government or our secular powers are at odds with the tenets of our faith. So they would take action against the arms trade, against unethical investments, so various actions by the Treasury. So it was a core group of people, including two members from the Catholic worker movement. I think it will be interesting in the context of what you're doing with this series to look at the Catholic worker movement and at Dorothy Day. But the Catholic worker movement has always operated very much in a gospel living way. So there were people already formed in a group who were prepared to use NVDA, nonviolent direct action, if they felt it was an outliving of their faith. And then with Christian Climate Action, they saw that, with Extinction Rebellion, they saw that their ethos aligned directly with Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion is absolutely 100% non-violent. So that's a very, very important thing to understand. This is non-violent action. This is passive physical resistance, but it's non-violent. And at every step of the way, it is non-violent. I think it's really important because the media do not always portray that. But I have lived on the streets with these people. I have been amongst them. And it's absolutely inherent to everything that happens that there is no violence and that things are done in a love that I describe as love for neighbour, that those of other faiths would and no faith can also subscribe to. So the Christian Climate Action made the decision to ally themselves as a group within Extinction Rebellion, and are very much turned to by Extinction Rebellion because of the roots of Christian Climate Action and the fact that they know that we are trustworthy. If Christian Climate Action decide to do something, it happens. So they hold a very real part in the heart of Extinction Rebellion, and with other people was seen very much as a good thing, you know, and it's wonderful to be able to be that witness within a wider organization. So they've now grown hugely, and within Christian Climate Action worldwide now, I don't know the membership, but it will be easy to find out. But what exists is a daily prayer online. So we pray online together at 9 o'clock every morning. There's an interfaith aspect to that on a Wednesday at 7. And then there are workshops. And then if there is some form of action, then we would join in together in local groups. But it's very important to say that we understand that not everybody is in a position to be arrested or should be. So it's not that to join Christian Climate Action, you would be prepared to be arrested. It's to join Christian Climate Action is to say that this is a priority for our times for people of faith.
Yeah, thank you. And people can access Christian Climate Action on the website, presumably?
Absolutely, yes. And there's lots and lots of resources there.
Yeah, good, thank you. Now, Helen, this is about having the courage of your convictions, and taking a stand does have consequences, doesn't it? And for you, it has had, undoubtedly must have had some consequences. Has it brought with it a criminal record, for example?
Yes, it has. Yes, I pleaded not guilty, and I did that on the basis of human rights, that there are 3 clauses within the European Declaration of Human Rights that are actually ingrained in our law, which is interesting, going back to the Romans question, that actually within our system, there are laws that supersede other laws, and these ones take priority. So the argument of necessity, that there is a necessity that is greater than the necessity of a car to travel up the road, which is that even within our own context, pollution is taking this many lives a year. So there's lots of legal things within that. But I was found guilty. So I do have a criminal record. Interestingly, for your listeners, we cited the case of Ziegler, in which people blocked an arms trade exhibition, and that's been overturned. They went to appeal, and they've actually had their conviction relinquished by the High Court. Right. A magistrate's court will go by the book. So I was in a magistrate's court. If you go to a High Court, quite often the consequences are different. And in fact, in a recent case, the Shell 7, who caused some criminal damage to property, were found not guilty by a jury who listened to the arguments and could see and returned a not guilty verdict. However, in a magistrate's court, most of the cases like mine are being found guilty. So I have a criminal record. I was very clear with the church hierarchy about what I was doing, and I think they would and have been supported very well. So it has no consequences for my ministry. For some people, it would have consequences for their employment. Yes. It has some minor consequences for insurance, and I don't know yet. I mean, for me, the biggest sacrifice of all was to find that subsequent to this, my eldest son decided to be married and is getting married in America, and I don't know whether I'll get into America.
Okay, so that's where the personal consequence touches, isn't it? And might you consider appealing at all? Is that a possibility?
No, if it was a high court decision, I might appeal, and it costs a lot of money to go to appeal and a lot of time and effort. I mean, one of the consequences is actually just anxiety, time, effort. It's not something that I would choose to do. The court system is dehumanizing. It deliberately makes it an unpleasant experience. Not that no one is openly aggressive, but it dehumanizes you. So you have to go through that. There's a lot of support from within the movement for that. So I won't go to appeal, but it is interesting to keep an eye on people who do go to appeal, because of course that makes case law, and every time case law is made. So that one of the things that's interesting to learn is that the reason some people do damage to property, not to people but to property, is because if you go above a certain level of damage, and a lawyer did this, a recent, it was about 3 years ago, can't remember her name, she deliberately broke the doors of the Shell building because she knew that that would take her to the High Court, where you could then go through the appeal system. So there are cases in which people are really deliberately testing the system.
Yeah, I understand. Helen, you've been really open and honest, and I really appreciate what you said today. What about people listening to this interview? They'll be really interested in what you said. What would you say to them about having the courage of your conviction? What message would you like to pass on to them?
I think that so much of this is about being physically and emotionally able, and that's, we all carry different burdens. But wherever you are, if you can open your heart to the needs of the world, if you can not turn off your empathy, and it's tempting to turn off one's empathy because it's hard to see what's happening in our world, then the sheer pain of what we see in terms of so many aspects, not just climate, but climate, of course, has a knock-on effect for so many other things, movements of people and so on, that then to find a group of people with whom you can share that, because there's something very powerful about solidarity. The early church did not do anything nobody did things on their own. They lived in community and they supported each other, and the solidarity that I have experienced with other Christians and non-Christians has been hugely supportive, so that I don't feel alone. I feel very much, and I think also you touch upon these holy moments, these special moments when you open your heart like that. So there are consequences for your faith journey, and we're all on that journey. I didn't just suddenly decide to do this. This has been part of a long process. I'm no spring chicken, and we're all in different places on that journey. But in the end, there is a cost to loving our neighbour, and I think we protected ourselves a bit from that in the ways in which we live. Yeah.
Helen, thank you so much. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and we'll be discussing that in the next few days. So,
good luck with your discussions. I think it's a great thing to be doing. Okay, thank you.
All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.